All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third series in the COWA virtual webinar learning events. Thanks for joining. I know everyone's busy, but it's great to take a break and catch up. And we've got two guests with us today. Tim Urban, you guys probably recognize his face, our president, and he'll give us an update in a bit. Hi, Tim.
Hey.
And Mr. Marty Cooper, our special guest today, also known as the father of the cell phone. Hi, Marty.
Hi, Dan.
Great to have you guys. Thanks for joining. And got people coming in. So thanks for you guys joining in. We'll kick things off today, as we always do, with having Tim give us an update of all things COWA, and then we'll roll from there. So if you're good with that, Tim, we'll start off with that while I load your slides.
I am, yeah. I'm sure everybody wants to get right to Marty, so I better be quick, huh?
All right, sounds good. Let me share the slides here.
Thank you.
And
there we are. Welcome to COWA. Glad everybody came. I'm so excited. Dan's doing just such a great job getting so many people to come and talk to us in this educational series, and I really want to say, first and foremost, thank you, Dan, for your super efforts that you've done in all this. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Tim. Thanks for everything you're doing as well. So I'll go ahead and get to your first slide. You guys can see the slides, okay? I take it.
I can see mine. Thank you. I wanted to say thank you, and first and foremost, for the annual sponsors that continue to step up and help our organization. EWS, POD, Vertex, and ETS have all signed up this year as annual sponsors, and we very much appreciate their continued support, and we really look forward to seeing everyone from those companies at our golf tournaments, which is coming up in the 15th, going to be at Arrowhead again this year. Looks like we're going to be able to do an old style golf tournament where we get to have a shotgun start, we get to have interaction, and we get to have a meal afterwards and a raffle. So we're really excited about that. And then we're also going to have our Top Golf event the night before. So everybody get ready for that, and watch our website for the updates as those shows up, and see when you can start getting your space. We also are going to do the clay shoot again in September. So again, a big time for everybody. And but I think everybody just really enjoys blowing up those poor little discs out there. It's really fun. So anyways, thank you, Dan, and thank everybody for all your support and help to COWA.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.
All right, so next what I want to do is just say a big thank you to Vertical Bridge. They're our sponsor today. As always, we can't do these events and everything we do without the great support of our sponsors. So Vertical Bridge asked if we could play a short video that they put together, and we're happy to do that. So take a couple minutes to watch that video, and then we'll move on from there.
Thanks, Dan.
All right. Thanks again, Vertical Bridge. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you guys soon in person. One last quick update. Our next webinar event, we're going to take a break in April. We'll have Wireless West is coming up, and that'll be a virtual event again this year, unfortunately. But we are going to take a break from our series so that everyone can attend the event for Wireless West, and keep your eyes open for that. I believe the dates are April 20th and 21st, if I'm not mistaken. But keep your eyes peeled for that. And then we'll pick up again in May, where we're going to have Jeff Bratcher, FirstNet CTO, and Garrett Doyle, who's the Rocky Mountain Regional Manager for AT&T FirstNet. And they're going to give us a great update on all things going with FirstNet in terms of how the build out has gone, what kind of coverage improvements we've seen in the state of Colorado, some use cases of how first responders have used the network, and where they're going in terms of new technology, preparation for 5G, things of that nature. So we look forward to that, and we will go from there. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Marty Cooper. Marty has recently come out with a book called Cutting the Cord. And so if you guys haven't checked it out, you can buy it on Amazon and all your favorite bookstores. And it's a great story about not just the first call and the invention of the phone, but a lot of things that are going on in the industry. So I highly recommend it. And Marty's been gracious enough to offer up a handful of signed copies that we're going to send out to some lucky winners today. So we're going to choose those winners based on the best questions that we get throughout the event. So be sure to submit your questions using the Q&A question button on your menu on the Zoom controls. We will read those questions to Marty so he can ask them, and we'll expect to spend the last 10 or 15 minutes today going over those questions. If I see a question early on that makes sense to ask while Marty and I are chatting, we'll ask it then. So without further ado, I would like to get started with Marty. Let me get this shut down here. And Marty, I want to thank you again for joining, and it's great to have you. One of the things that I wanted to start off with is, everybody knows, you worked with Motorola for 29 years, and while you're at Motorola, you're famous for your invention of the first cell phone. Let me stop sharing my screen here. This will be better. All right, great. There we go. So now everybody can see our faces. Tim, I'm going to let you drop off if you'd like, so you don't have to stare at the screen, if that's fair. Great. So Marty, 29 years at Motorola, invention of the first cell phone, the first phone call. Tell us a little bit about that experience, not just the first phone call and inventing the phone with your team, but just that whole time at Motorola, when everything that was going on at the time.
Well, the first thing I could tell you, Dan, is these were really primitive times. There were, would you believe, there were no personal computers. The digital camera had not been invented. The internet did not exist. There was no such thing as a large-scale integrated circuit. So it was a very different time than today. And the most important thing that was different was that all communications was controlled by the Bell system. They had a monopoly. They decided what our products were. They did virtually all of the research and development in the industry that is so beautifully typified by the Colorado Wireless Association couldn't exist because there weren't any suppliers. The Bell system decided who was going to be. So that really was the driving force that got us to put the emphasis on the portable phone that we did. The fact that the Bell system was the decision maker, their decision was that the future of wireless was car phones. And of course we didn't believe it.
Yeah. And I know when you read the book, it gives a really great detail about that. And it also goes into detail about that first phone call itself. And you mentioned, AT&T's role at the time. And if I'm not mistaken, Joel Engel was the person you made your first phone call to, and was he the head of AT&T Cellular division at that time?
That's right. He was managing all of the development efforts that were going on.
Right. And as you pointed out the other day, we wanted to clarify that this AT&T we're talking about now is very different than the AT&T of today, right? This was the monopolized Bell system, very different than what we know as AT&T today. But why did you choose to call Joel of all people? I think we know the answer, but I'd love to hear the story.
Well, it was serendipitous, but I never miss an opportunity to needle somebody. I think I've already done that with you a few times in our startup, because and it really was just being mischievous. But I didn't decide to do that until the last minute. My number one focus was I was demonstrating this phone to a newspaper reporter, and I wanted him to get the real experience. And you don't do much of a demonstration sitting in a chair talking to somebody when you're demonstrating a portable phone. So we were walking down 6th Avenue, and my second focus was, is this phone going to work? Because I know the members of your association are very practical people. You should know that this was a hand-built device. There were literally many hundreds of components, all hand-wired, and many of them designed specifically for this phone. It was really a hack. So even at 1 o'clock the morning before we made that demonstration, there were engineers still working on the phone, fixing things.
Yeah.
So at the last minute, I decided, I'm going to try calling Joel. And I took my phone book out of my pocket. It's another example of primitive times, printed phone book, called Joel's office, and miraculously, Joel answered, not his assistant. And I said, Joel, it's Marty Cooper. He says, hi, Marty. Joel, I'm calling you from a cell phone, but a real cell phone, a personal, handheld, portable cell phone. Silence on the other end of the line. I suspect Joe was gritting his teeth. Joe doesn't dispute that he got that call, but he doesn't remember it. I guess I can't blame him, Dan.
That's a great story. Now, you guys had two phones. Is that correct? You had two handmade phones, or was it just the one?
There were two phones. That's right. Okay. We had a spare just in case one broke. There was an engineer standing by at every demonstration with a spare.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, tell me, so at the time when you were working at Motorola, this is obviously what you're most famous for, but there was some other pretty cool projects you were working on as well. Tell us about a couple of those other projects. I know you started off with doing the car phones for AT&T early on, right? And then there was some other cool projects that led up to this.
Yeah, well, people have forgotten how big the paging industry was,
right,
in those days. But at its peak, there were well over 50 million paging customers in the United States alone. It was a huge industry, which has practically disappeared by virtue of the presence of the cell phone. But we had a lot of startup projects that I was fortunate to work on, including the use of wireless to control traffic lights. We did the first rural telephones, which in those dial days were in fact, well, there were no phones that existed in the rural areas, and we made a push button phone for rural. So I was fortunate enough to get to work on a lot of advanced technologies.
Yeah. I'm gonna, we had talked about, we're kind of curious to see from our audience what people's experience is. I'm gonna launch a quick poll. If you guys get it pop up on your screen, we'd love to see from the audience what people's history is with their first phone. When did you get it? How old were you? What kind of phone it was? It'd be great to have everyone participate in that and see what our audience's experience is with with their first phone and how it relates to the different phones that have come along over the years. While people are answering that, um, there was a discussion you and I had preparing in the past as we've spent some time together, and I told you that if there was a Mount Rushmore of the cellular industry in the U.S., that I for sure would put you on there, and you kind of humbly and graciously said, "Well, I don't know about that," but I'm saying right now you're on my Mount Rushmore. But would love to talk a little bit more about who else we would put on the Mount Rushmore of cellular, and those of you that are on the webinar, chime in as well on the Q&A or on the chat. Would love to hear you guys' thoughts. But who else would you put on the Mount Rushmore of the cellular industry in the U.S., Marty, and why?
Well, the two people that come to mind have gotten very little or no credit for what happened. But the chairman of Motorola at the time was Bob Galvin.
Mm-hmm.
And Bob Galvin, over the period of time from when the Bell system made their first proposal to have cellular to when the FCC decided that it was going to be competitive and that the industry was going to select defined what a cell phone is. Bob, we spent $100 million for a company the size of Motorola. This was bet your company, and I would put Bob Galvin on your Mount Rushmore. And the other one was Craig McCaw,
Mm-hmm.
who pretty much decided that there was going to be a future for independent providers of cellular service. And he started a number of the independent cellular operators
Right.
in various cities. So
yeah, I agree totally with Craig McCaw. I mean, he really created what was the first nearly nationwide network when he put all of those networks together and really put a lot of pressure on the RBOX, the regional Bell operating companies that had split up from AT&T, who had all the B-side licenses, and really put that concept of a cellular provider on the map and created a lot of competition. So I would agree with Craig, and he also did a lot. He with Nextel, right, and turning that SMR band into a cellular network. I think it was the first packet switch cellular network in the world, if I'm not mistaken, for sure in the U.S. So I think Craig's a good one. I know you and I also talked a little bit about the importance of the regulatory side of things for the industry and the role that the FCC played in creating spectrum. And I think you had mentioned, was it Ray Spence?
yeah, Ray Spence was the chief engineer of the FCC. And Ray Spence, you know that you all know that the commissioners are lawyers and politicians. They don't make technical decisions. The technical people do that. And Ray Spence was a visionary, and he not only guided the selection of a competitive portable cellular industry, but also the trunk system, which I'm sure that some of your constituents were or are presently involved in. That revolutionized the land mobile industry. And Ray Spence was the architect of that as well. We, in fact, that was one of my contributions, but it would have gone nowhere if Ray Spence did adopt that and the FCC legalized it. So Ray Spence is on our mountain.
For sure. And then I think one that I would like to add, and I know maybe you would agree or disagree, but I really feel like Steve Jobs was really sort of the more modern era version of you and your team at Motorola in terms of the first smartphone. And when he got the first iPhone out there, did that exclusive deal with AT&T, that really pushed the boundaries of what people could do and really created a personal communication device more than just a phone, right? Camera in your pocket, a MP3 player in your pocket, a browser in your pocket. I don't know, how do you feel about Steve being on that Mount Rushmore if we had a fifth?
Well, I'm not crazy about Steve Jobs personally, but his contribution was to make the smartphone useful and usable, and his the idea of having user interfaces that were comfortable for people, and not only applied to the smartphones but to all of the technology that we use. So there's no question that Steve Jobs made an enormous contribution.
Yeah.
What he did was build a device that was comfortable for him to use, and at least up until now, that's an enormous contribution. My only objection to that is not everybody in the world is like Steve Jobs. And I think the future of the cell phone are cell phones that will accommodate all different kinds of people, because every one of us is different than every other person. And the idea that a single cell phone, the iPhone or an Android phone, is going to satisfy everybody doesn't make any sense to me at all. I think the future of cell phones are customized phones that adapt themselves to your personality.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, probably not if, but when that happens, right? Let's move forward a little bit more to the present day. If you were to give a state of the industry, given your experience and your participation in industry pretty much from inception, what would you say is part of your state of the industry address in terms of the good and the bad of where we're at as an industry in the U.S.?
My view is that we are in early days. Think about it, that as you just point out, the smartphone is only 11 years old, 11 or 12. And we're just learning how to use a cell phone, and the place to look at where the biggest advancement are not in the advanced countries, or in the emerging countries, because most of the use of the cell phone in the States and in Europe and in China is in social media and things of that nature, texting, whereas in places like Africa, India, Mexico, the cell phone is an essential part of modern life. It's the only way that people in some villages get medical treatments. And with people that haven't never had a doctor before, now have doctor in the city treating them in the tiniest villages. In Africa, the only system for moving money and saving money is a system called M-Pesa, and that system has moved over 1 billion people out of severe poverty in the last 20 years. These are really fundamental things. And we are just moving into that era with the phones in the advanced countries, because here the potential is for us to be monitoring people and revolutionizing healthcare. Being able to sense whether a person is getting a disease before that disease happens, and there's a potential of eliminating disease. Education is going to be revolutionized. One of the things that the pandemic did is to teach us how versatile remote learning is. And it also taught us that there are different ways to teach people where you can customize teaching. You know, the whole idea, Dan, of learning being a person standing up in front of a class and lecturing for an hour is ludicrous. If you think about a future in which every one of those people has a device that is connected to the internet, and every person has access to all the knowledge in the world. They know more than a teacher does. So the role of a teacher is going to change in the future, all because of wireless. And the biggest thing, Dan, that is happening now and that is going to be much more robust in the future is the ability for people to collaborate, to do what we're doing now. Unfortunately, what we're doing now is me lecturing, but I'm a dinosaur. If this was a really good effort, you and I'd be talking and everybody would be participating. We're just learning how to do that. That's a new way of communicating. I think that's going to make society so much more productive. So I repeat what I said at the beginning. We're only in early days with cellular in the real world.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's kind of great to get your take and your perspective on that. What are you doing with your time today? What's keeping Marty busy besides doing webinars with people like me and signing books and of course you just wrote the book. What else is keeping you busy?
Well, I always worried about staying busy, and I've always been overcommitted. But I am I'm fortunate to be on the FCC Technology Advisory Council. We meet for the last year. It's been virtual, but we've been meeting in Washington uh, quarterly, and we meet in committee meetings every week. Very time consuming, but we are trying to focus the future of wireless. Most of that focus, I think, is overemphasized, is on 5G. I think 5G is important, but I am trying to get this council focused on things like education, where having access to the internet is vital. You cannot have a person be educated without having broadband access, and it has to be wireless broadband. And 40% of the students in this country do not have that kind of access. And I think it's even more than 40%. And it's either because they don't have coverage or because they can't afford it. Those are bad excuses. And I think that somehow we have to figure out how to get broadband wireless to every student in the country, and to change our educational system so that education is tailored to the individual and not archaic as it has become.
Yeah, yeah, I'd like to pick up on that topic a little bit later in the conversation and even engage the audience a little bit on thoughts and ideas on how we incentivize carriers, how we incentivize the industry to go after these areas that are more rural and to address that digital divide. So let's pick up on that a little bit later in the conversation. But before we do that, I want to talk about one more item that is kind of the here and now, and that's the existence of. It was funny when you and I met the first time. I was talking to you about the use of low band spectrum and how the carriers that are currently using low band spectrum, have some advantages with that. And I referred to low band spectrum as 600 megahertz, 700, 800 megahertz, and your response was, well, that's not low band spectrum. That's high band spectrum. Low band to us was 450 and below, right?
We call it the low band 25 megahertz.
Right.
That's almost DC to modern engineers. High band was 150 megahertz.
Right.
UHF was 450. And you will find this interesting because I did mention that in the book, that even at Motorola, there were people that said that 900 megahertz would never be useful for personal communications. It was too high, the range was too short. So we really had a battle even within Motorola about whether a gigahertz was appropriate. And as you know now, we're using 2.5 gigahertz, and we have Citizens band at 3 gigahertz, and frequencies up to 6 gigahertz are assumed to be ultimately useful for personal communications.
Well, and of course, what we call high band in the industry now is millimeter wave. We're looking at 28 gigahertz, 39 gigahertz for 5G deployments. Verizon just reaffirmed just this week that they do plan to use and are using those high bands for some of their 5G nodes in large venues and things. What are your thoughts of the use of that millimeter wave technology, whether it's for unique applications or even directly to the phone?
I'm not excited about a millimeter wave. I think 5G is a great opportunity. I think it's going to be very important in the future. But the push for millimeter waves is more, and I can say this because we've got a small group here, and I don't think there's anybody here from the certainly not from the Bell system because they don't exist anymore. But millimeter waves is a spectrum grab. There's no practical use for in millimeter waves for individuals. Think about what the carriers are offering with millimeter waves. They're saying, well, we've got high speed now. You can download a movie in a minute instead of 10 minutes. And we have low latency. Well, Dan, when was the last time you had a latency problem? And we got slicing. Well, it turns out what people care about is coverage and cost. And the carriers are focused on a future industry, which is basically the Internet of Things. They want to run factories, and I don't object to that at all. But we haven't finished yet with the Internet of People, and I think that something has got to be done urgently for education. But there ought to be coverage everywhere in the country, and the technology exists. I was really inspired by the video that you showed at the beginning, because the pictures there were of tall antennas in rural areas. And I just know that their technology exists, and I'm not guessing it's technology that I have worked on. I started a company that was involved in it. There was technology that, combined with the kinds of antennas that were shown in the video that you showed, there is the potential of covering almost all of the country economically. There is no reason why you can't develop technology that will provide broadband for students in the Rockies at $5 to $10 a month, something that everybody could afford, that could provide coverage for literally for everybody all over the country. So just to summarize, I think 5G is great. I think millimeter wave is an experiment that all of us are being forced to pay for. I think that anybody that spends the extra money for a 5G phone ought to realize that they're getting a bigger phone that has a poorer battery life, that costs more, and they're getting no benefit from it at all.
Well, that's pretty clear what your take on it is. So I appreciate that perspective. And you and I have talked a little bit more, and maybe this is a good time to continue talking about the whole idea of rural broadband and education. And if anybody didn't see the, I think President Biden signed today the most recent stimulus package, and as an example, there are a lot of efforts that have been going on around rural broadband. There's another effort that part of that money that was approved, that 1.9 trillion today, was I don't remember the exact numbers, 9 billion, maybe more, for E-rate. E-rate's a system that provides money to bring broadband to schools, many of which are in rural parts of the United States. That E-rate money is typically used, not always, but typically used for fiber, to bring fiber to the school and make sure that that school has broadband, which is key. And you and I tossed around a couple ideas the other day about, well, could we do a better job of a country with the FCC, the private sector, to put our heads together to look at these kinds of programs and say, well, if we're already spending that money to bring fiber to the school, why not give incentive to a carrier to work with the school, put a cell site at the school, and extend that broadband with just even a single cell site to the community near the school. And so that now students and families near the school now benefit from that money we just did to bring broadband. What are your thoughts on those kinds of ideas? What do you think it would take to get the FCC, the politicians, and the private sector at the table together to think about these sort of efficient solutions and leverage all these disparate programs together to create these kinds of opportunities? Do you think that's doable? What would it take to do that?
Well, I'd like to hear the comments of your constituency, the people on this phone. Don't you think it's possible for somebody to create the cell site equipment that's focused on education? Simple equipment that doesn't have slicing, it doesn't have a lot of the features of 5G, that I envision putting up a tower. Towers are very inexpensive now, of having carrier have a number of systems in rural areas that is focused on education, to have the cell sites provided to that carrier free of charge, because they're all going to be on schools, libraries, or maybe even donated, to have the spectrum available to that carrier at no cost.
Right.
With an obligation, the carrier would have an obligation to provide service in the range of $5 to $10 a month for students.
Right.
I think there's a business there. I think somebody could make money at it instead of having the government, in essence, subsidizing major carriers to use inappropriate technology to serve a market that they're just not interested in.
Right.
So anybody that is stimulated by that sees a business opportunity, I would love for you to reach out to me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good, your point about the phone. It's sort of like, Chromebooks are what they use in the E-rate program now. That's a slim down PC that's very affordable and basic, and it's the same concept that we could do the same thing with phones. So that makes sense. Couple of questions that people have started coming in with, I'd like to share with you and get your thoughts on, and please, if you guys would still chime in on any questions you have or suggestions on this digital divide topic. We'd love to get a little discussion going here amongst us. And I can even open up your microphone and your camera, anyone in the audience, so you can share your thoughts. But one of the questions we had from John, going back to the first call, John wanted to know what frequency band was the first call operating on, and how much transmit power did the phone use to communicate back to the network that you guys built for it?
Yeah, it was we do have techies on this call.
Oh yeah.
It was 900 megahertz. That was a totally new band for us. And as I told you, we had people in the company at Motorola that it would never work. It was 900 megahertz. What was the other question?
The transmit power that the phone had, yeah.
1 watt.
Okay.
And which is basically what the first commercial phones were. And that was limited mostly by battery life. The first phone used a nickel cadmium battery. Anybody remember nickel cadmium? The battery was, well, here it is. This is a mock-up of what the first phone is. And the battery was about 1.25 inches of the back of this phone. So the battery technology alone was archaic, and yet the battery life was less than a half hour of talking, and the battery would run down. Of course, that wasn't a problem because this phone weighed almost 1 kilo, over 2 pounds, and you couldn't hold it up for a half hour. So the battery life was not a problem.
And what was the cost of that? Not that phone that you made the first call on, but the same version of that It was called the Dynatac, and the Dynatac that was actually used for so a lot of people may not know, but that first call was in April of 1973. Is April 3rd? Is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it was almost 10 years later before the first cellular network actually launched in the US. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. So it took 10 years from the time that you guys got that concept, that proof of concept, for these networks to actually be built. So, but in '83, when that first cellular network was launched, I think it was in Chicago, if I'm not mistaken, where the first cellular call was made on that first cellular network. That was a Dynatac. How much did that Dynatac cost at the time, or in today's dollars even? Do you remember?
$3,900.
Wow.
And that's in 1973 dollars, which would be equivalent to something over $10,000 today.
Wow.
But that may sound like a lot of money, but a cellular car phone at that time was $3,000 and plus installation. So you're still talking about a $7,000 or $8,000 car phone. So, and yet they sold quite a few of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was not a commercial price.
We have another question that's related, and I don't know if it's a question or more of a statement. I think it's worth bringing up because there may be some semantics between first cell phone versus first portable phone. So I don't know this person's name was an anonymous question, but or statement, but this person mentioned several other people that may have been known for constructing the first, what this person says, portable phone. John Pierce, William Francis Channing, Eli Whitney Blake Jr. were the names that this individual mentioned. What's your familiarity with those individuals and the distinction between what they did versus what you and your team did with the first cell phone? I think there's a difference between a portable phone and a cell phone in the way we're talking about it, right?
Well, that's right. There were a lot of portable phones before cell phones came along. The real contribution of cellular technology was capacity, the ability to have more than just one person on a channel in a city, which is exactly what the state of the art is up until 1983. The total capacity of all of the mobile telephones, of course, they were almost all car telephones, pre-1983 in a typical city was perhaps 100 phones. And yet the carriers, because they had to give service to all of the politicians and people with influence, would put 1,000 or 2,000 phones on 30 or 40 channels. And the result was that at the busy hour, it was virtually impossible to make a call. The probability of making a phone call was like 5% during the busy hour. It wasn't a practical service. There were people that made portable attaché case phones. They took a mobile phone, put it in an attaché case.
Yeah.
But they were not very practical because the power was limited by the battery. I would suggest that the first real cell system, it was a system that Motorola built in Chicago for the Chicago Police Department, where they divided the Chicago into, started out being 13, ultimately 20 cells. And the purpose of that was to allow police officers to carry portable phones, because the superintendent of police in Chicago at that time, Orlando Wilson, wanted his police officers on the street with the people instead of isolated in their cars, and still in communications. And so we developed we called it a brick. That phone I just showed you was also called a brick at one point. But we developed a handheld portable phone with a remote microphone that sat on an officer's shoulder, so that when he was in the car, the antenna, which was on the microphone, was transparent through the car windows. But when he walked on the street, he could also communicate because he was always in a cell. Mm-hmm. So, of course, there were these individual technologies that existed, but the combination of high capacity and portability is what really made the cellular industry.
That brings up, maybe this would be a good, I'd love, if you're okay with it, I'd love to share your law, Cooper's law of spectrum capacity with the audience and speak to that a little bit. Is that okay if I share that? I'll put it up on the screen.
Sure.
Yeah, let me throw that up there. This is Marty's law of spectrum capacity, as he says, similar to Moore's law. It's sort of the concept of, you start, as you said, 100 phone capacity total back in the early, or 100 device total in the 1900s. Well, why don't I let you take us through this and what this means to you and what the implications are for us today and in the future.
Well, I have to make up my own criterion of what capacity is, and that is, how many conversations could you hold in all of the spectrum in the world, all of the usable spectrum, using the most modern techniques at any given time. And I started with Marconi because he did the very first commercial communications around 1900. And the capacity at that time for the whole world is maybe 3 or 4 conversations, because at that time, there wasn't any such thing as a radio channel. What Marconi did was create a big spark, which sent out a huge blast of RF energy, and he called that a dot. And if he did it twice, it was a dash. So that was the entire spectrum. I think you're all aware of what has happened since there. We've channelized, we've gone from Morse code to AM to FM to CDMA to what we now use in LTG and LTE and 5G. We've extended the frequency range from the order of what might have been a megahertz in the Marconi area up to, as Dan pointed out, to the millimeter waves, 39 gigahertz. We have expanded sharing to using smart antennas and other technologies to the point where we can talk to 10 or 100 people on one channel at the same time. So if you put all of those things together, we have increased the capacity of the usable radio spectrum using the most modern techniques by 10 trillion times from Marconi to now. 10 trillion times of increase. So and yet people say, well, spectrum is scarce. Well, the only reason spectrum is scarce is because the Senate has said that in order to get spectrum, you have to lease it from the government. And yet every time we wanted to do something new in the radio spectrum, there's always been spectrum available. Technology has always stayed ahead. So this concept of spectrum scarcity is almost fraudulent. It's certainly inaccurate. There is an issue, however, and if you notice on this chart, those of you that are engineers and think like I do on charts, that I showed LTE and 5G as ovals, not as point. And it's because the carriers, at least the biggest carriers, have elected not to use the most modern technology. And their capacity using existing technology is down at the bottom of the ovals that are marked 5G and LTE. They are deliberately, in my view, not using the most modern techniques to get capacity up, because they're perpetuating this myth of spectrum scarcity. In the future, people are going to realize that somehow for the next 50 years, we've got enough capacity to keep increasing, to serve more and more people, to reduce the cost, and the concept of spectrum scarcity is going to disappear. We're going to be doing virtually everything wirelessly and with broadband.
What do you think about, you mentioned the citizens band, also known as CBRS, 3 gig band, 3.5 gig. What is your thoughts on that concept of networks becoming more private, less dependent on carriers, on service providers, where individuals, private companies, enterprises can benefit from using that spectrum? How do you see that playing into your spectrum capacity law, and also just more generally into the benefit of the industry and the community as wireless technology can grow?
Well, Dan, I tend to think about things in the very long term. And it turns out that the concept of giving somebody or leasing a radio channel to somebody for exclusive use, it doesn't make any sense at all. Mm. You ought to give somebody access to the spectrum for the time that they're actually communicating. And that ought to be on the optimum frequency band. It ought to be for the shortest possible time. It ought to use the minimum amount of bandwidth. And if you could create a system that did that, the capacity of the spectrum would be so much greater than anything that I've showed on a curve, that the idea of spectrum scarcity would be ludicrous.
Right.
And I think that Citizens Band is a very beginning to that. The vision that I described of having optimum use of the spectrum, we're generations away from that.
Right.
We've got a lot of technology to be developed, but mostly a lot of politics to get over.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we are going to resolve that at some point, and the whole spectrum is going to be Citizens Band.
It's a good take. I like that. I like that. I think you're right. A couple more questions. John Rowe has a very simple question. He wants to know, have you removed landlines from your home and office?
Well, it's funny that you say that. I cannot figure out why I have a landline, which is not really a landline, it's on the cable. But because at the moment, the only thing I get on my landline is spam. So I'm going to have to get rid of it, but just as a matter of habit. But it turns out my wife and I exclusively use the cell phone, and the landline is there theoretically for emergency purposes. But no, I think landlines are archaic and unnecessary. Well, and most of the world does. There are, last I looked, there were the order of 60,000 landlines in the United States, and more cell phone subscriptions than people. So I guess the word is getting out that landlines are archaic. Well, I hate to keep pressing that one. Think about what the difference between a landline and a cell phone. Landlines are designed to connect one place to another. Cell phones connect a person to another person, two different services.
Right. Right. Let's see. We have a little bit of time left. I want to make sure we get some of these other questions in. Ryan Ford wants to know, what are your thoughts on Dish jumping into the business as a carrier?
You'll have to tell me what is Dish is proposing to be a cellular carrier?
Yeah, they're in the process of building out a exclusive 5G network right now. They were the recipient. They've acquired spectrum over the years, and they were kind of the recipient of part of the T-Mobile Sprint deal when T-Mobile and Sprint merged, in terms of getting some of those customers as well as some of the network assets as part of that merger.
Yeah.
FTC required. So Dish is in the process of working on building out a nationwide 5G network as we speak, and so Ryan's curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, Ryan, I absolutely support that. I think that there is the thing that the industry needs most of all is competition. I don't think that AT&T and Verizon really compete with each other. They are legacy carriers. I think we need some aggressive people in the business that will focus in and try to do something in their spectrum that is different what the other people do. As I mentioned before, I think everybody is different. Every person in the world that has ever existed is different from every other person. And the idea that one service, one class of service will satisfy everybody is also ludicrous. So I'd love to see more competitors, because I think what competitors are going to do is focus in on unique services, on ways to serve classes of people better than the other carriers are doing. And the result will be that we'll all benefit. So I support Dish, and I hope there are other carriers that will come on.
Great. Just so everyone knows, I launched another quick poll. Would love to get everyone's thoughts on our upcoming golf tournament this year while you're listening to some more questions and answers. So fill that out if you would. Let's see. Jeffrey Selby asks, Marty, did you ever envision the transformation of society using cell phones as it was back then to it is today? So I think what he's asking is, at the time, did you envision it becoming what it is right now?
The answer is absolutely not. I like to think that I'm a visionary, and in the sense that everybody was going to have a phone. Absolutely, we did do that. In fact, the story that we told was someday When you were born, you would be assigned a phone number, and if you didn't answer, you had died. We knew that was going to happen. The personal computer had not been invented. How could we imagine that every person in an advanced country would have a phone that had a supercomputer in it that was capable of what modern phones are? We could never have imagined that. And as I mentioned before, the digital camera had been invented. Even 10 years ago, if you told somebody that very few people would have a separate camera, they would have told you you're crazy. And the latest cell phone, the latest iPhone that I get, I guess the competitive phones have it as well, have got 3 different lenses, a huge amount of computing power just for taking pictures. So the only people that need cameras now are professional photographers and hobbyists. So no, we did not envision all these other services. But think about where we're going in the future. If you remember what I said earlier in our conversation, collaboration is the biggest advantage of communications. It's the thing that is going to revolutionize the world. It's going to solve poverty and a lot of other problems. And the idea that people could talk to each other and collaborate was fundamental to what our vision was back in the old days. And it's still the most important thing, people talking to each other.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to launch one last poll for everyone, if you guys wouldn't mind giving us some feedback on how things went for you today. While that's up, we have a couple more. Greg, Seth, Greg, good to see you. It's been a long time, buddy. Would love to see you in person someday. Greg gave us a comment on our Mount Rushmore. He has some good feedback. He said he'd like to include some of the original Bell engineers, for example, W.R. Young, who postulated the cellular concepts and frequency reuse and cell splitting and things of that nature. I'm guessing that while you guys were kind of rivals with them at the time, you guys respected each other as engineers and would probably, I would assume, think like of Greg, that they had a significant contribution. Yeah.
Right on the mark, Greg. And thank you so much for bringing that up. Ray Young absolutely should be on that mountain, because the memo was actually written by Doug Ring, but Ray Young really was the guiding force behind that, and certainly he deserves recognition. Amos Joel made a big contribution. He was at Bell Labs in the concept of handoff, and so there's no question that Bell Labs, and I ought to reemphasize that I had enormous respect for the engineers at Bell Laboratories. My lack of respect was for the people in the Bell system who could not imagine anybody dispensing of the wired network. They were convinced that wires were with us forever. Wireless was just a little ancillary service.
Yeah, that reminds me of when I used to work at US West, and the CEO of Quest, after they bought us, proceeded to tell us that wireless was a fad and he was not interested in investing in fads, and Quest proceeded to divest of all of their wireless business, and I wonder if he regrets that today. So one last question from, again, this one's from John Rowe. John wanted to know, Marty, do you remember that Bell employees thought the cell phone would give them time to golf? I think that's the question. Does that ring a bell, what John's asking?
Yeah, well, we may have started that because when we created the pager, the biggest feature of the pager was for doctors. A doctor who had a patient who was in trouble could go out and play a game of golf and know that he could get back to the hospital in 10 minutes if he had to. So this was our way of describing the freedom that came from wireless communications. But characterizing golf as the big advantage of the cell phone. Would be stretching that a lot. But thanks to John for bringing that up.
That's funny. Well, listen, I thank you so much for your time. I know everybody's busy, and we're at the top of the hour. This has just been amazing, Marty. You amaze me with your insight, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time to speak to us. And I'm sure that our audience appreciates it as well. So thanks again, and thanks to everybody for joining. Any last words of wisdom before we check off, Marty?
Oh, thank you for inviting me. And I was serious about challenging your audience. If anybody wants to be an educational carrier and thinks that they have ways of doing that, I'd be grateful if they reach out to me, and they can do that through Dan. I'm delighted to give books to some of the people that ask questions. And the rest of you, you're stuck with buying your own copies, which you can get on Amazon or Barnes and Noble and lots of other places. So thanks again for inviting me, Dan.
Thanks, Marty. Yeah, and for all those that did ask questions, we'll be trying to reach out to you via your email that you signed up with. And if you asked a question, didn't hear from us, give me a shout. Dan@McVaugh.net is my email, or you can send it to education@COWA.org, co-wa.org. So thanks again, Marty. Thanks for everyone joining, and everyone have a great rest of your week. Bye now.